Hello, this is Dwight Mutonono, also known as Mnyaradzi and also known as Mutos. Welcome to the Connection Desk, and we are continuing today with Acts chapter 16. We're going to be in the first portion of the first section of Acts chapter 16, from Acts 16 verses 1 through to 5. In the last session, the last time we were together, we were talking about Paul and Silas being sent out by the church. They were sent out by the church in Antioch. Barnabas and John Mark went off, but then we find, Barnabas and Mark sailed for Cyprus. Barnabas just took John Mark and they sailed for Cyprus, it appears. But then it says that Paul chose Silas and left commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. And it seems like he was sent out by the church, and he might even have been given. And what would usually happen when people would be sent out in that way by the church is that the church would also be saying they're taking financial responsibility. So they were probably sent out with some finances to get going on the trip that they were doing. So it was a very different send-off for Paul and Silas compared to Barnabas and Mark. Let's get into Acts chapter 16 now, and we're going to read from Acts chapter 16 verses 1 to 5. We meet for the first time a young man called Timothy as we enter into this portion of scripture. So let's go into it and read. He came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was a Jewess and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. So Paul takes Silas as a traveling companion. It seems like Silas was an older man, an older traveling companion. He originally had come with them from Jerusalem as a prophet, and he had encouraged the church in Antioch, and Paul called him back. Whether he called him back or whether Silas actually remained or whatever happened is not clear. But anyway, Paul and Silas leave Antioch and they go back to the churches that they had planted in that first journey. And they don't go to Cyprus, but they go to the Galatian area where they had planted some of the churches. And the place that they end up is this place called Lystra and Derbe. But then they also take a younger person called Timothy. Just as John Mark was serving Barnabas and Paul in the first trip, now we find Timothy as a younger companion and helper who's coming alongside them to help with the work. This is a good and important principle for leadership development and for future growth of churches. If you want to be able to have generational growth, it's always good to have people who are younger, people who especially are now into their 50s and so on. It would be good for you to have a practice of taking somebody along wherever you go who is maybe 20 years younger than you and 20 years or more younger than you, because they will be able to learn a lot from what you take for granted. So that's the principle that we have here. So Timothy is added as a younger companion and helper. The principle again is of plurality of leadership, and if you read the New Testament carefully, you see that the leaders always had a team around them to help each other discern what God was doing. So they never really worked alone. In fact, when you read Paul's letters, he's always writing it. He's not just writing it as Paul by himself, but it's Paul and another person. It's usually another traveling companion that works with Paul, that is part of the team, that actually is part of who writes the letter together with Paul. But generally, as a principle, Paul always would have some sort of apostolic team with whom he worked. And it allows leaders to always have more than one perspective or voice when you're listening to God together. It's always a good practice to have somebody else who gives you counsel. So in a multitude of counselors is found wisdom. And we'll see some of that as we read and as we continue to read, into how they ended up in Macedonia and so on in the later part of chapter 16. So he was from Lystra. So this young man called Timothy was from Lystra, where Paul had been left for dead. In that first trip, Paul had been left for dead, and he was in this place called Lystra. We also learned that he had a Jewish mother and a Greek father. If in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, we read that his grandmother was Lois, and his mother was Eunice. It says, I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded now lives in you also. That's 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5. So while his mother and grandmother had a sincere faith in the Lord, it's not clear when this started and whether this is a Christian faith in the narrowest sense that is being talked about, or the Jewish heritage of faith. In fact, I would say that it was probably the Jewish heritage of faith that is being talked about when you read and understand this thing well. Paul calls him my true son in the faith. That's in 1 Timothy. At the beginning of 1 Timothy, he calls him my true son in the faith as he addresses Timothy. The question then becomes, did he lead Timothy to the Lord when he was in that first trip? You see, because maybe they had a Jewish training, Jewish background, and when he met them, both the grandmother and the mother, and maybe even Timothy as well, he might have led them to the Lord or to Christianity on that first trip. But it's not clear exactly how it is that Timothy became a believer. Whether when he says my true son in the faith, he means the son that he has discipled, or whether it's the son that he has led to the Lord and discipled. We're not clear exactly how it is. Whoever led Timothy to the Lord, what is clear is that Paul took him along as a young disciple that he would work with. If you use this mentor-protege metaphor from the Greek world, it's not a biblical word. Mentor is not really a biblical word. It's from Greek thinking. But you could say that Timothy would be a protege, somebody who is being taught and learning from Paul. Discipler image, then he was Christ's disciple. I want to emphasize that he was not Paul's disciple. He was Christ's disciple who Paul was shepherding. Sometimes the language that we use can have subtle problems, because if you say you're a disciple of Dwight, be very careful with that, because some people can take that and they put themselves in the place of Christ and begin to actually take people, and draw them to themselves. This is the danger that you have. What Paul says as we will read on in the book of Acts chapter 20, as he visits the Ephesian elders, that there is this danger that some, talking about the elders, from even among you, some will want to draw the sheep or want to draw people to themselves. So be very careful about using the my disciple kind of language. It's not your disciple. It is Christ's disciple, and you are an under shepherd. You are helping shepherd, or you're helping this young person, or maybe even it might even be an older person that you're discipling, but you are helping them to walk, or you're pushing them towards Christ. Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ, or another version is, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So that's the most appropriate message to disciples. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. If you find that I'm not following the example of Christ, don't follow me, please. Let's not just learn everything from our disciples. Some of the things that they do might not be the best. Okay, so follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. So then let's talk about this circumcision story. The leaders in Lystra and Iconium, they were related churches. If you remember when on that first trip, that there were people who came from Iconium and actually helped stone Paul in Lystra. So, but these leaders in Lystra and Iconium, the churches that had been planted there, they spoke well of Timothy. So before taking a person at apostolic level, which is what Paul was doing, he was taking him at apostolic level to work at a global or at a inter-church or level where you are now overseeing, or you're working with multiple congregations. Before you take a person to that level, let the local congregation endorse it. The local congregation must speak well of it. And that's what happened with Timothy. Yet the Greek father, Jewish fathers had the primary responsible for their son's Jewish education. But it seems Timothy's mother and grandmother took on that role, and they taught him. And it seems his father was neither a proselyte, that means it looks like he did not become part of the Jewish faith, nor was he a Christian. Why? Because Timothy was not circumcised. So Jews generally rejected intermarriage, and some were very strongly against it. So already this marriage might have been frowned upon by the Jewish community. So though Timothy had a strong Jewish upbringing, he was uncircumcised. Again, this would have been frowned upon by the community at that time. So the just ended controversy that we had in Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council, it was whether Gentiles should be circumcised. And of course, the conclusion at that meeting was, no, it's not necessary for Gentiles to be circumcised. But then they made the decision to circumcise Timothy. Why? Well, Timothy's case would have been in some ways a new one, because here we are dealing not with a Gentile proper, but somebody who could be regarded as a Jewish person. And to avoid controversy, he was circumcised. And sometimes it's better not to exercise freedom than it is to insist on it. They were probably going to be going to Jewish synagogues in their travels, and they were going into new areas. And cultural intelligence is to say, why go in with something that will hinder and will cause controversy? So rather than go in with this story that might cause controversy, Paul and Silas chose to say, okay, let's just do this for the sake of the gospel. So Christian leaders, we need to be careful of this. Yes, they had won this victory, but you need to be careful that you are not quarrelsome or given to violence. You see, they could have been combative, looking for a fight, pugnacious, wanting to show that, hey, we did this, we have won this victory, and Timothy does not need to be circumcised. That would have been gloating, and really it would have been just trying to push this thing down the throats of the Jewish, the people with Jewish sensibilities. So these are non-essentials. And sometimes it's better to lose a battle and win the war. Now, people who insist on exercising their freedoms and rights might not be called to be leaders. If you have problems with some people who are saying, no one can really stop me. Where does the Bible say I shouldn't do this and that and that? And we're talking about an area of freedom. And you're having that fight and that discussion with the person. Maybe what it is they are a Christian and they can be part of the church, well and fine, but maybe they're not ready to be a leader. Because leaders must lay down their freedoms whenever those freedoms can be a hindrance to the gospel. So Eunice's marriage to a Gentile would have been controversial to some. Jewish, as we've mentioned, Timothy was Jewish in culture and upbringing. So strictly speaking, being uncircumcised made his faith questionable. So why allow this controversy? They chose not to allow it. The churches, the message that they did is they did go and tell the churches about the Jerusalem Council, and the main message to the churches that they had planted was to make sure that they all knew about this decision of the Jerusalem Council. Remember, in that first trip, it was a big fight, and the Jewish influence, or the Judaizers, kept following them and eventually stoned Paul in Lystra because of this very issue. So they went and they showed that no, this has been resolved at Jerusalem Council level. And it was an age without internet, without phones, without radios, post offices, or any of these modern ways of communication. Letters had to be taken by hand to the intended audience and read out loud at a meeting, at a gathering where people would come together. So it was a very important document in the first century, and it would require a lot of time and money to send one. So the churches were strengthened when they received this communication from Jerusalem, this important communication to let them know that, hey, you can be a Christian, or you can become part of the people of God without being circumcised. You're blessed. We'll be looking at Acts 16 verses 6 to 15 in the next session. And now we are into the area of Philippi, and we'll learn a few things from there. God bless you.